Hello, students. Let's begin with one of the most interesting aspects in the field of law, legislative drafting. This is the second video that I'm uploading on this subject. In the previous video, we have already seen the meaning, definition, and object of legislation. In this, we will see yet another interesting aspect of law, and that is the process of lawmaking. We know that the fundamental source of lawmaking is the legislature. Other institutions, whether it is lawmaking by the executive or the judiciary, have to build up on the essentials laid down by the legislature. So we understand that the subject of legislative drafting is of extreme importance for the legal process. And so is the process of making law. So let's begin. So in this video, we would be introduced to the process of lawmaking, legislative policy, passing of the bill before it becomes an act, the first stage, the second stage, and the third stage, and of course, the president's assent. Now, since legislation is one of the primary functions of the parliamentary institutions, therefore, it is quite interesting to know as to how these institutions proceed to discuss and pass a bill before it becomes an act. So we all know that the legislative department of the Ministry of Law and Justice is primarily entrusted with the job of drafting all the government bills. And we also know that India is essentially a federal country, and one of the important features of any federation is the division of legislative powers between the federation and the states. So those of us who actually are very much familiar with the scheme of the Constitution and are aware of the threefold scheme of distribution of powers, we know that the allocation of legislative powers is governed by three lists, of which two are exclusive and one is concurrent. So the legislative procedure in India is based on constitutional provisions, the rules of procedure relating to the house concerned, that is, in whichever house it is being placed and being originated, and the parliamentary conventions. Now, these together constitute the structural framework for the legislative process. The Union Parliament and the state legislature exercise their legislative powers in accordance with the 7th schedule to the Constitution. So we know that list 1 enumerates the central subjects, whereas list 2 enumerates the subjects of which state legislature alone can make laws. And then there is the third list, which contains the concurrent topics on which both can make laws, with the condition that in the case of a conflict, it is the central law which shall prevail over the other. Now, coming to the legislative scheme, we actually are to observe one fundamental thing, and that is that the legislative scheme must be sound and workable. Of course, the constitutionality of the provisions sought to be enacted as law and the form, arrangement, and wording of bills no doubt demand primary attention, but the preparation of a bill involves many other considerations as well, which are no less important. Okay? So, the person who is drafting the bill should try his best to anticipate and provide for all problems and situations which are likely to arise. And therefore, it is actually expected that the legislative scheme which is expected to be given effect to must be sound and workable. It must fit into the general pattern of the statute book. Now, draftman is to see that the bill carries out the intention of the sponsors in clear, concise, and unambiguous language. Now we all know that it is not an easy task. He must express the legislative intention in clear, concise, and unambiguous language. Now, thereafter, one thing also is to be noted, and that is the private member can also introduce a bill. Any member of the parliament or the legislative assembly, whatever the case may be, other than the minister, can introduce a bill. Now, such a member shall draft the bill and forward it to the legislative secretariat for scrutiny. Now, thereafter, the bill should be introduced in the manual like a government bill is introduced. Okay. So, for the preparation of the bill, the formation of the legislative policy is necessary. Now, here we ought to know that there has to be a proposal regarding the subject on which a legislation is being proposed. Now, this proposal is placed before the cabinet. Now, here placing before the cabinet is for its approval in principle. Since we all know that the legislations generally involve financial expenditures, and the government would be in a better position to say whether such a financial expenditure can be meted out or not, and therefore it is placed before the cabinet for its approval in principle. Now, at this stage, administrative, financial, or political considerations are more likely to be involved rather than the legal considerations. And these have to be sorted out by the officials in the administrative ministries or departments concerned. Now, once these are settled, rules of business framed under Article 77, Clause 3 of the Constitution require that proposals for legislation should be referred to the Ministry of Law for advice as to their feasibility from the legal and constitutional points of view. So, after this, such proposals are considered by the Ministry of Law in its advice section. And advice is also tendered on the necessity or desirability of such legislation in the light of existing laws. Now, here we should note that the competency of Parliament or the Assembly to legislate on the subject under the Constitution is also considered at this stage, and the broad lines on which legislation may be undertaken are likewise often indicated. So therefore, we can say that here this advice at this stage is of a general character. Now, after this stage, it goes to the Legislative Council. So this scrutiny is done by the Legislative Council. So after receiving it from the Department of Legal Affairs, the Legislative Department attempts a draft bill in consultation with the officials of the Administrative Ministry or the department. Now here, the Legislative Council carries on his shoulders great responsibilities in the preparation of bills. Although it is not his function to determine the legislative policy, he has to make a substantial contribution in rounding out the policy and filling in details, as there are always additional policy matters that cannot be known or foreseen until the drafting process is well underway. Now here, the Legislative Council is to indicate what sanctions and other legal provisions are necessary for the legislation to be effective and complete. Now, here, the other statutes on the subject, maybe in India or outside India, which can also be considered. And they are actually considered here itself at this stage. Now, after a proposal is forwarded by the Legal Affairs to the Legislative Department for its comments and drafting a bill, It attempts a draft bill, as I said, in consultation with the officials. And after considering all these aspects and after drafting the bill, it is again sent to the nodal ministry from where it had originated. Now here it is sent for vetting. That is, the nodal ministry actually vets it to see whether all is covered or not. So though they are not equipped to consider the legal aspects, this nodal ministry, but it is for them to see if what all they wanted in their proposal is covered or not. Okay. So after knowing the process in brief, very brief, actually, as to what all happens even before the bill is drafted, we come to the passing of the bill before it becomes an act. Now, it actually undergoes the three stages: introduction, consideration, and passage, also known as the first reading, the second reading, and the third reading of the bill. Now, this particular part is discussed in more detail in the coming slides. So we already have seen up to now as to what all goes while drafting a bill. Now, once the bill has been drafted by the legislative department, generally the copies, which are again printed by the legislative department, are to be supplied to the secretariat few days before the bill is to be introduced, and generally it is 2 days before the bill is to be introduced. Now this bill is to accompany the statement of objects and reasons, the financial memorandum if expenditure is involved from the consolidated fund, which generally is involved, then the details of the modifications if there are any to the act or the ordinance or whatever is there, and also the proposals for the delegation of power if required. If in the legislation it is actually expected that the power will have to be delegated, then such proposals are also to be accompanied along with the draft bill. And the recommendation of the governor under Article 2071 or 2073 of the Constitution is so required. So I really hope that in case of the legislative assemblies as to how these legislations actually take shape. Now here, this draft bill is also to be accompanied with a written request from or on behalf of the concerned minister that the minister would like to introduce the bill. Now, this is a formal. So it actually gives a brief. Along with that brief, the written request has to be there. Now here again, the bill goes to the cabinet for its clearance before being introduced in the parliament or the assembly. And after the clearance from the cabinet, the copies of the bill are circulated to the members. Now at this stage, bills are generally numbered. Please note that these serial numbers would actually be different from the serial number of the resulting act. Okay. So now we come to the first stage of the passing of the bill, and that is the introduction of bill. It is also known as the first reading. Now we already are aware, since we have read the Constitution, that a bill may be introduced in either house of parliament, right? That is, barring the bills which come under Article 109 and 117 Clause 1, particularly to which Clause 1 of Article 110 applies, and we refer it as a financial bill. All other bills may originate in either house of the parliament or the legislative assembly or the legislative council in cases of the states. Once the proof of the copies of the bills to be introduced in either house of parliament are sent to that house by the Ministry of Law, that house takes the charge of the bill. And then on the day the bills are put down on the agenda for introduction, the minister in charge of the bill makes a formal motion for introduction, which is seldom opposed. Now we are to know that at this stage, it is generally the principles of the bill that are discussed. So four things may happen. The bill may be taken into consideration, or it may be referred to a select committee of the House, or it may be referred to a joint committee of both the houses, or it may be circulated for eliciting public opinion. Now, it is worthwhile to note here itself that there can be particular considerations with regard to a bill. Now, that particular question or point can be given for consideration by a standing committee which is formed to consider that particular point or that particular question and submit its report. So all these committees, suppose the bill is referred to any of the committees, they are to submit the reports and thereafter the second reading takes place. So now we come to the second stage, that is the second reading, consideration. Remember? So after the introduction of the report of the committees, if it was so referred, the bill is considered by the House clause by clause. Okay? So we can say that bill in this stage is for consideration. So here it is open to the members to move amendments which are within the scope of the bill and are relevant to the subject matter of the clause to which they relate. Of course, there are rules regarding admissibility of amendments and also notices thereof in order to afford the minister concerned an opportunity to consider them. So here, the speaker may call each clause separately, and when amendments relating to the particular clause are disposed of, then he or she puts the question of passing the bill clause by clause. Okay. Then comes the third stage, and that is the third reading. So this is the last motion in respect of a bill, and that is that it is to be passed with or without amendment as the case may be. Now discussions at this stage are confined to arguments in support of or against the bill as amended or otherwise. As soon as the bill is passed by one house, it is transmitted to the other house for concurrence. Of course, with a message to that effect. Under Article 107, a bill is deemed to have been passed by both houses if it has been agreed to by them, either without amendment or with such amendments only as are agreed to by both the houses. We know that. Article 108 provides for a joint sitting of both the houses in certain cases for resolving differences. We are also aware of this. And Article 109 actually prescribes a special procedure for money bills, right? So when a bill is finally passed by both the houses, the Secretariat of the House last in possession of the bill, of course it will be Lok Sabha in all cases of money bills, sends a copy of the bill as finally passed to the draftsman for formal scrutiny. Now here at this stage, the draftsman will be able to point out errors in printing if there are any spelling, punctuation, numbering of sections, clauses, cross-references, marginal headings in the Act you might have seen. So after doing all these things, then the bill is reprinted and sent for the President's assent. Now coming to the President's assent. And so, of course, we come to the last part of this video, and that is the President's assent. So finally, the bill is then printed by the Parliament Secretariat in its final form, and 2 copies are sent to the Ministry of Law for submission to the President for his or her assent. Now, as soon as it is assented to by the president, it becomes law. The Ministry of Law then gives it a number, the number that we see on the acts, okay? And the act is published in the official gazette as an act of parliament. Of course, the date of its operation may be different. I hope you remember this particular aspect, right? So I really hope that this particular video might have actually helped you in understanding the process of the lawmaking. Okay, so all the very best. Keep on preparing for the exams and take very good care of yourselves. Thank you so much for listening to this video. God bless you all. Bye.